I'm Nick Hernandez, and you're listening to the Positivity Matters podcast. We talk with well being researchers and leaders in a variety of fields where they're trying to implement well being science. Today, I have Professor Matt Gallagher. He is professor of clinical psychology with the Texas Institute for Measurement, Evaluation, and Statistics at the University of Houston. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, how did you get interested in well-being and what is it?
It's a good question. I became interested in undergraduates learning about abnormal psychology, all the standard things that we learn about in psychology majors of trying to understand the positive side of functioning as well. And so started looking into not just what can go wrong with mental health, but what can go right, and then what are factors that might promote that. And so for graduate school, I went to the University of Kansas to work with Rick Snyder, who developed hope theory. And that's been a big focus of my work is understanding how hope is a cognitive trait and source of resilience can promote positive aspects of mental health as well as promote resilience to anxiety, depression, PTSD, various forms of mental illness. And so that's something I became interested in early on and have kind of kept my focus on in terms of looking at how it intersects with more traditional topics like anxiety and depression.
Fascinating. Right before we started the podcast, you were telling me you said some magic words, I believe, complete state mental health.
Mhm.
Um, Sort of the visualization that comes to mind is like an XY coordinate system where the Y axis is like mental illness and the X axis is mental well-being. And then this sort of the absence of mental illness does not imply the presence of mental well-being. Kind of a starting point, which is kind of mind blowing. Kind of like
Yeah.
it's sort of like, well, what is it? What is mental well-being made of? And it feels like the thing you've focused on is maybe the part of mental well-being. Hope, it seems like, is the essence of the thing, along with happiness or emotional well-being.
Mhm. Yeah, that's exactly right. The complete state model of mental health, a lot of work that Corey Keyes and others have done, showing that the absence of mental illness is not by itself the presence of mental health. And this is something we see in clinical psychology working with clients that just because you've reduced the anxiety and depression, that's of course very important, but that doesn't mean that you have promoted pleasure, meaning, social relationships, that we need to focus on both aspects of people's functioning and they are correlated, but they are also distinct. And so making sure we are not ignoring those positive aspects of our functioning, we need to promote those as well. And so there's various strategies and kind of psychological factors that positive psychology has identified that might be important promoters of happy lives and meaning and purpose. And yeah, hope is the one that I've focused on the most in my own research.
It seems to be kind of an integrator. There's for me, my entry into the world of positive psychology and learning about well-being was through a strengths finder. And the suggestion when I took it was, here's your top five strengths. And my first question was, what are my weaknesses?
Mhm.
and then and the and then it was, well, what if you just do more of your strengths? This is kind of where you tend to experience the most joy and meaning. And then it's like, well, what about my weaknesses? And it just kind of took a while to sort of
Yeah,
like
it's a
get
different
that
approach and
mind.
lens. And
Yeah. So I guess the idea is like focus on your strengths and like manage weaknesses when necessary. Is that
yeah, that we want to look at the whole picture and that when we have deficits, vulnerabilities, that aren't going right, we want to be aware of that. We want to acknowledge that. We want to target them. But I think what's often missed is what might best help us to even work on those areas where we're struggling is capitalizing on our strengths. And so if you are curiosity, if that's a strength for you, hope, there's various kinds of ways in the Strengths Finder and there's other strengths taxonomies that can be used. But if you leverage those things that come more naturally to you, that are those sources of resilience, even if you need to focus on an area where you might be struggling, using those tools, using those skills, what are your strengths, can be an effective way of targeting those areas that you might be struggling with a little bit.
Yeah. It feels like I've been thinking about strengths and hope a lot, and it feels like the relationship is kind of like, and well, anything where, well, actually, let you describe the hope construct in case any listeners haven't heard it before.
Absolutely. So hope is a concept that's been around for a long time in terms of the idea that having a hopeful perspective on the future could be a good thing. But it was really the work of Rick Snyder at the University of Kansas, starting in the late 80s, that helped to bring more scientific rigor to what we understand hope to be, how we can define, measure, and then target it with interventions. And so in Rick's model, he identified hope as a cognitive resource or trait that involves the ways in which we pursue our goals. And so thinking about as we go through our lives, much of our behavior is based on the goals. If we want to succeed in the workplace, have a family, whatever it may be, we're working towards these goals. And as we think about those goals for the future, Rick defined hope as being a key resource that would promote our ability to actually achieve those goals in terms of two components. And so there's the pathways component, which that's how do you get from A to B? You've got your goals, but you need to figure out what are your strategies, what are your routes, what are your ways you're trying to achieve that. And so the ability to identify those pathways, merging that with the agency, that's the motivational component of hope, the ability to maintain the pursuit of those pathways towards those goals, even in the face of obstacles, frustration, that was what's really important as well. And so it's the synergy of those pathways and agency components. That's how we define and that's how we now measure hope. And there's now more than 30 years of work supporting that model, looking at the benefits of hope and people of all ages across the world that have shown that it's an important predictor of mental health, well-being, academic outcomes, outcomes in the workplace. And so it's been a really robust area of work within the field of positive psychology.
I've been I'll I'll take a crack at describing it and then you can correct me. How's that
Mhm.
sound?
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Uh I've heard the acronym of GPA, sort of that we have the ability to envision goals that are meaningful to us. The G, and goals thinking, is the skill. The P, pathways thinking, and like you were saying, like how to get there, how to get to our goals. And then for the A, I see this iteration. So first, it's like we have to actually take action, and then as we discover roadblocks and challenges, the ability to reformulate the pathways, and then the A, hopefully at some for some percentage of the time where we accomplish the goals. And then sort of after iterating continuously, then it goes into agency, and or willpower. And I've heard
Mhm.
the goals thinking and pathways thinking sort of condense into what you might call way power. And that's kind of been the way that I've been describing hope to other people.
Yeah,
Does that
the
sound?
way power and the willpower for the pathways and the agency, those are definitely terms that we've used to kind of characterize those complementary kind of forces that help us to work towards our goals. So yeah, I think you're right on.
And then uh, it also feels like anything that a person does intentionally, where there's that goal and pathway that's envisioned, is aside from whatever you're trying to do, you're also building hope, like simultaneously. Is that?
That's how when we're working with whether it's clients or in school settings of helping people to recognize that whenever you're pursuing those goals that you can view it as that way, this is a chance to foster and nurture hope, and that even if there are setbacks, that that's still useful information and that can be progress in terms of okay, my initial path, this goal, that didn't work at all, I know that now and I can recognize that. And the next time I'm pursuing this, I'm now better prepared to pursue my goal. And so having that mindset that you're always in kind of a growth or a learning mindset as you pursue those goals, that's helpful. And that's something we have found in terms of when we study individuals who hire and hope, they have more of that approach in terms of, okay, the first pathway didn't work. That's fine. That's useful knowledge. Let's try another one. And they stick with it and they have that sense of perseverance where it's not at the first sign of frustration, they throw their hands up, but they keep actively pursuing the goals. And that tends to help them achieve it.
I like it. Okay, so I'm not too far off track.
Nope, you're on the right track.
Okay. um one of the one of the other this one I think it was kind of similar to Hope. I think it was founded in an attempt to treat mental illness, the acceptance and commitment therapy. I
Mm-hmm.
believe this was a Stephen Hayes and Kelly Wilson, and I believe there was another co-founder. But it feels like it encompasses hope theory, but then it takes it back a step and asks people to reflect on their values. I've thought of the strengths approach kind of as a sort of a preliminary approach to thinking about one's values. Like if your strengths feel spot on, I think you can just, you know, run it through the ACT framework and say, yes, it's a strength. Gallup is telling me it's a strength, and I'm committing to it as a value, kind of
Mm-hmm.
as the that existential turning point, centering of values. And then um like the VIA, that strengths finder, it feels like that one brings in like playfulness and beauty, and maybe those are there in the Gallup one, but they're not as like on the surface. And
Yeah.
so it's like, and so then it's like, okay, well, here's some other things to consider that the VIA brings in. And it's like, well, maybe there's other things that neither one is focusing on. So I like to encourage people to step back after you've done all the strengths finders and see, is there anything else that really matters a lot to me? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
cool, embrace that as a value. And then it's kind of like we're ready to go into the goal setting, and you can kind of dip back into the values whenever needed in order to like find meaningful goals. I guess that's kind of the way that I've been sort of contextualizing hope within this values kind of perspective. Is that, I know that's not necessary. Is it like, do you see benefits to that?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And there are a couple different taxonomies of strengths, and the VIA, the Gallup, there's various ways that have been developed, and partly that reflects that positive psychology is kind of a newer specialty area within the broader field of psychology. And so we've had a lot more iterations when it comes to our diagnostic manual for mental illness. We're still a little earlier on in the stages of figuring out exactly what's the best way to characterize all of the ways which you might have character strengths and kind of sources of well-being. And so there's a lot of overlap between the Gallup system and the VIA system. There's also lots of work that's been done on just separate character strengths of looking at hope, gratitude, curiosity that's very consistent with those larger systems, but is coming from labs that are more specifically focusing on what are the benefits of gratitude? What's the benefit of curiosity? And so I think when you're looking at those systems and trying to make sense of the results, oftentimes what we find is that if people have taken both the Gallup and the VIA, there's a lot of consistency. And some of the terms are a little bit different. As you mentioned, there's some that are included in one system, but not the other. But overall, there's a lot of consistency typically in terms of what's identified as some of your key strengths. And so part of it is finding the system that kind of resonates with you in terms of how it's characterizing the language that's used. If one clicks for you, that's great. Leverage that to help that improve your understanding of what those strengths are for you, how those are consistent with your values. You mentioned ACT, and that is a increasingly widely studied area of treatment, kind of third wave form of cognitive behavioral therapies, and that is big emphasis on values and the action and the way that we pursue our lives. And so I think it's finding a system that resonates, how you can understand your strengths, and recognizing that all of these systems, they're different in some ways, but they all have the benefit of helping us to put a greater emphasis on our strengths, whatever they are, and how we can use them to pursue our goals and promote well-being.
Yeah. What kind of got me was in the VIA, hope is one of the strengths that's there.
Mhm.
But then if I'm trying to say that all the strengths build hope, it's like uh apparently there's a distinction made in psychology of trait-like things and state-like things. And my hunch is that if hope is in one's top five strengths, that you probably have it as a trait. It's
Mhm.
very strong as a trait. But then it also has that it's almost like it feels like it's kind of an umbrella for everything else in a way, kind of. And
Yeah, I think I'm admittedly biased towards the study of hope. It's something I've been focusing on for 20 years now, but it is something that complements a lot of the other strengths. And so I think that's also something that is important to recognize that, we have hope. There's also related theories of optimism, and that these are strengths that we view as being complementary. And so it's not that we're trying to identify, what's the one winner when it comes to predicting well-being, but it's important to have hope in some situations. In other situations, having gratitude is important. Or in situations where it's good to have positive expectations, but you don't have that sense of control, having just a broader sense of optimism might be important. And so identifying each of those different strengths and how you can foster them and cultivate them in your own life can be really important. But we have found that hope is one that, when it comes to predicting various outcomes, it does tend to be pretty robust in terms of promoting mental health and promoting resilience to mental illness.
yeah, yeah, that's it's it feels like it kind of bridges across from the uh sort of the therapeutic and the healing over into the to me it seems like hope is the fundamental essence of mental well-being itself.
And it's something that was talked about for many years before Rick even kind of started studying it more scientifically, the idea that a core element and an essential element in psychotherapy was fostering hope. And that whether you're targeting anxiety, depression, something Menninger talked about 50, 60 years ago, that a clinician, one of the common elements of effective psychotherapy is often going to be cultivating or fostering that sense of hope, the belief in the client that the future can be better than the present, whatever it is that they're struggling with. And that is something that we now have increasing evidence that the ability to promote hope in psychotherapy, that is found across a number of empirically supported treatments and is a really important predictor of recovery in those treatments. And that holds across a wide range of disorders. And so there's really promising evidence now that hope is an important factor. It's not the only one, but it is an important one when it comes to fostering recovery.
It feels like the becoming intentional about mental health, mental well-being typically is a result of having poor mental health and mental well-being or some experience, stress, trauma, maybe not mental illness, but it feels like it's suffering that brings us to the well-being table.
Mm-hmm.
Typically there might be someone out there that just had a great childhood, great upbringing, and found a strengths finder, and then they were just off to the races, and they went from super high mental well-being to like off the charts. I haven't met that person yet.
Yeah, I think people come from different backgrounds and like had different levels of adversities and different challenges that they face. I think it is absolutely the case that the more intentional focus on one's mental health, it is often stress that might bring attention to that and help us to recognize, take a step back and, hey, we need to focus a little bit more about this. That is, everyone gets busy into the routines and that might be working for you, might not be working for you optimally. But what's important is that we do have a good understanding of the factors that represent mental health, and we have an idea of what are strategies that are effective in promoting that. And so it's easier said than done, but we do have tools that when people are kind of ready and interested to try and cultivate those aspects, there are effective strategies that don't guarantee it. I mean, there's still always adversities we face, and there's lots of things going on in the world these days. But we do have tools and strategies that can help to stack the deck in our favor.
Yeah. Yeah. There's kind of a metaphor that I like to, and that's like comparing it to physical strength. It's like chances are, if you look back in your life, there have been points in time, maybe at present, you have no meaningful goals. But if you look back, probably there's been things over one's life that you've been interested in.
Hmm.
And insofar that you've been interested in something and tried to pursue learning more about it or doing something, like you've also built hope along the way. You've had instances of experiencing hope, building hope. And so the past feels like it's a place from which to um, reminisce in a constructive way what it's like to have hope. And then I, it feels like chances are it's like physical strength. Like if your body's moving, you have some strength.
Hmm.
And so, like, with intention, strength can be elevated. With intention, hope can be elevated. Is that is that a fair comparison?
Absolutely. I think it's something that it is a skill or think like a muscle that if you exercise it, that helps to reinforce it and strengthen it. And I think as we all go through our lives, we have different learning experiences, things that go well or poorly, and that helps to cultivate and foster our sense of hope, which we know from a lot of research across, short term or even up to like a year. When we study the stability of hope, individuals' levels of hope is pretty stable. So if you can help get people to have higher levels of hope, and get them to recognize how to use that skill, that resource, that tends to be a lasting resource for them. And we know it's pretty stable. We just need to work with people to cultivate that. And that's the fortunate thing is we have strategies, whether it's in the context of psychotherapy or brief interventions in educational or medical contexts. We have tools that are shown to be effective in fostering and promoting hope. And we found that once we do that, that can lead to lasting changes in terms of individuals' levels of hope. And so it's thinking of it like a muscle that the more you exercise it and how you think about it, when you're starting an exercise program, that's when it's most difficult. But as you get that traction, get that experience, it can be really helpful for fostering and maintaining that.
Let's go to the Olympics
That would be fun.
of hope.
Yes.
I think people that are sort of at the edges are the hope champions in a way. Scientists, entrepreneurs,
Hmm.
artists. It feels like they're high hope people just based on the nature of the hope construct itself. You almost have to be
Yeah.
in order to be at that place. It feels like.
Yeah, I think to pursue your goals and to reach those upper echelons of whatever your area of expertise is, I think to really work on that, it requires a lot of perseverance, determination, and that way power and that willpower that we're talking about in terms of pathways and agency. It's again, it's not the only factor that's ever going to be important, but it does seem to be quite important across many domains of life in terms of being able to maintain that sense of hope.
The piece for the accomplishment part, that's it. Kind of seems like you can fill your own bucket a bit through accomplishment. From what I've seen, it seems like the biggie for contributing to emotional well being would be the having good relationships. Is is that the case that the positive relationships has a bigger impact on emotional well being than accomplishment? Would that just be a personality kind of characteristic for which one fills your bucket more?
Yeah, I think it varies across individuals in terms of what might have the most maximal impact. But I think overall, we do find that having that social network, that social connectedness, that is such an integral part. And whether that comes from friends, from family, from workplace. You can achieve that goal in a number of different ways, but having that social integration is really important in promoting and fostering it well-being, and is in many ways a component of well-being. But we do find that these factors all tend to reinforce one another. And so what you're doing in terms of enjoyment, if that makes it easier then to cultivate those social aspects, and that makes it easier to then think about what brings you purpose and meaning, that having the intentionality across those domains of well-being, they all complement and reinforce one another. And so it doesn't have to be an either or with those aspects of mental health. It can be that they all serve to promote one another.
Yeah. Is there anything that increases happiness or emotional well-being more than good relationships and good hope?
I think those are definitely up there. There's also, basic things that we're all aware of, but we sometimes lose track of, like getting good sleep, making sure you're exercising. That it's not always complicated, but those are pretty fundamental to our mental health and well-being. And then a lot of the tools that, we focus on clients who might present with anxiety, depression, PTSD, some of the kind of cognitive skills, behavioral skills. You mentioned ACT therapy, the mindfulness acceptance. Those are tools of cognitive restructuring, mindfulness that you don't have to be struggling with a form of mental illness for those to be helpful. And so those strategies that are very effective at reducing various forms of mental illness are also beneficial in cultivating aspects of well-being. And so being present in the moment, having that non-judgmental openness and acceptance towards your experiences, having the cognitive flexibility that, the first thought you have about a situation isn't necessarily the right thought, and that you can be open to alternative interpretations. All of those skills and strategies, that's what we've learned, is that you can also use those to foster positive aspects of mental health and not just reduce forms of mental illness.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've kind of been trying to look for. I have this great affection for Corey Keyes. I had
Mhm.
him as a guest on the podcast when I got it started. And just that idea that like low mental health isn't mental illness. You might call it languishing or something
Yeah,
like that. Um, and that sort of that space, I kind of picture like the low end of mental well-being is languishing, the high end is flourishing, and then at some point in between you've got okay, like once you're out of
yeah.
languishing, and then good, what better than okay, and then flourishing. I mean, the descriptors probably are vary from person to person, but like
But yeah, Corey
that
Keyes has done some really essential work in this area of helping to clarify those distinctions that, yeah, mental health is more than just the absence of mental illness, and having that continuum from languishing to moderately mentally healthy to flourishing. And yeah, the terms might vary a little bit how individuals identify for themselves, but it's really important to have that focus. And so, yeah, Corey has done some really essential work in terms of helping us to understand these issues.
and it feels like there's kind of like a gap in the social institutions addressing like the various things like languishing, for instance. It's like maybe if you don't have mental illness that can be diagnosed,
Hmm.
you're not going to be able to go too far with therapy. um your chances are, like, I've seen these correlations with economic well-being and emotional well-being. So if your emotional well-being is really low and maybe your hope's really low, probably your income's not so hot either. I know that's not necessarily the case, but you probably can't afford a life coach to help you build hope. And it feels like there's this space between languishing and okay, that it feels like there should be some kind of social institution there to mind the gap
Yeah.
or something. What could that be? what kind of what could communities do to help people bridge that gap from at least languishing to okay? It feels kind of like a compassionate endeavor. If
Hmm.
Corey Keyes is right, if we do that, we might be preventing some mental illness. And it's like I like the idea of rather than having 100 ambulances at the bottom of the cliff, like why don't we put up a guardrail,
Yeah, and I think
aka help move people from languishing to okay.
foster that early on as a form of prevention. I think that makes a lot of sense, and we do have good evidence that mental health not only feels good, but it promotes resilience. And so we all experience stress and even trauma sometimes in our lives. And when you're starting from a place of greater well-being, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact on you, but it can make it easier for you to bounce back and persevere in the face of adversity and stress. And so having a greater emphasis on cultivating that, I think that's something the million-dollar question is exactly how you do that in terms of fostering that community. And it is a gap in some ways in our treatment approach, in that with clinical psychology, we do focus more on how do we help people recover from mental illness, and there's not that same emphasis on fostering mental well-being. And that's partly just the number of therapists that are available, and you mentioned life coaches. That is something that's increasingly common. That can be less empirically based in terms of depending on the credentials and the approach that people are taking. Where that's coming from can vary, but having more strategies, I think that's something that as the science of positive psychology continues to develop, hopefully we will develop a better understanding of whether it's self-help interventions, brief online interventions, things that people can do with their phone. There's mindfulness apps or something that have become very popular, and that is an important resource and tool that we use in a lot of forms of psychotherapy. And so there is some dissemination of strategies that can be useful for promoting well-being, but it's absolutely something that the field needs to continue to work on so we can make tools more available to help people identify and cultivate well-being in their lives.
Yeah. Um, while they're separate, I've looked through sort of therapeutic approaches that have been tested in non-clinical populations. I think typically subjective well-being is the outcome that's being assessed. ACT was
Well,
one of
Scott.
them. So
Mhm.
that sort of that, you know, this, it feels like values is the center point of ACT.
Yes.
And then with another one, this one, I believe it's behavioral activation planning from CBT.
Hmm.
And the way it was described to me is like get a grid out of your week, sort of each of 7 days with sort of a morning, afternoon, and evening, and intentionally do 10 minutes of something pleasurable morning, afternoon, and evening. Go for a walk, do a little hobby, um, whatever, but be intentional about injecting pleasure throughout your day. And it's so simple, but I never thought of doing that before. And that was another practice that was supposedly like there's no better intervention for the alleviation of depression than behavioral activation planning. Or something, I don't know, maybe it's like I forget the exact way it was put. Maybe it's like as effective as any medication, something like that. Um, but yeah,
Yeah.
again, tested in non-clinical populations, so it feels like okay, well that the goals that one chooses don't have to be super challenging. It
Hmm.
can just be things that are easy, but the trick is just remembering to do it. So,
Yeah, it's building those habits and building that consistency and those patterns of behavior. That's what it's easier said than done sometimes, but that is a very effective approach. And yeah, behavior activation is a very efficacious treatment for depression for many individuals. And that's part of what people struggle with depression is that withdrawal from the world, the loss of enjoyable or pleasurable activities. There's often more social isolation. And so helping people to schedule activities, to get out of their house, to get out of their heads in a lot of ways in terms of just like go do stuff, be physically active, be socially active. That is a very powerful intervention that works for a lot of people struggling with depression.
And then, so it feels like with hope, there's kind of like two factors, maybe like sort of an XY kind of thing again, where like one vector would be difficulty. And
Mhm.
so like, intentionally do things on both ends of the spectrum. Like just do things that you know are pleasurable, but just habituate it. And then on the upper end, it seems like there's the flow state seems to be from doing complex activities that have your cognitive capacity at full
Yeah.
to get to that flow state. So do challenging things for the sake of flow. Maybe I've heard a concept called toughness, and it's like do mentally and physically challenging things. And there's like I guess our stress response, like it's like taking our stress response system to the gym almost.
Hmm.
Like so that when you are intentionally activating your what is it, the sympathetic nervous system, um, that it like functions better when it's activated externally down the road.
Yeah, we do find that in terms of when we study the types of goals that people set when they are higher in hope, they do have a good balance between identifying pathways or goals that they're very effective at achieving. So building those mastery experiences to help to maintain that sense of efficacy, that sense of hope, but also figuring out how to appropriately calibrate stretch goals. And so things that challenge you that are not necessarily easy but are not so out of the range of possibility where it's likely to be more of a failure experience. And so, if you're starting an exercise program, you don't start immediately by running 20 miles, but how do you have a stretch goal that you pursue something that does challenge you, that requires you to test your limits, that is a rewarding experience that's challenging, and then you can keep kind of increasing that to build up that capacity. That is something we do find when we study people higher in hope, that they're also able to calibrate their goals and their pathways effectively in terms of identifying what is a way that is feasible but also still challenging.
Yeah. Um, and then I think the other so I think like the lower end of difficulty where you're just going for pleasure straight up.
Hmm.
Like cool. Uh that's I've heard that referred to like positive emotion, pleasure, that's the goal, like the happy life, sort of as a pathway of a good life. And then in terms of like the time factor, I've heard like the person that has zero purpose for their life as a whole, they just like wake up every day and it's like, I wonder what today's gonna bring. And like, just kind of what is it? You- Spontaneous, a spontaneous liver. Um, Sort of I've heard that pathway recently referred to as the interesting life or psychological richness.
Hmm.
And it's just sort of curiosity driven and no big life purpose. And then at the other end of that spectrum of like the temporal, how far out do the goals go? For the interesting life person, it's today, the next minute. And then for someone with very high purpose, it's like it feels like your life is about like you're here for one reason, kind of, and like you're having an impact or you want to have an impact on the world, and it's like for the rest of your life. It incorporates every minute basically, and any additional goals that you set, you're going to be doing it with like, well, is this going to help me with my purpose? Kind of.
Yeah.
So between the interesting life person that cares about the next moment, finding something to do, setting a goal like, today I'm gonna, I don't know, try well, I'm gonna learn how to uh yo-yo or uh, play a harmonica or whatever.
Hmm.
Like, uh, versus like, I'm going to end poverty, something like that. Like,
Yeah.
it's like you've got all these, I don't know, like intermediate time frames. But it feels like that just the immediate for goals for today, kind of that's the interesting life, goals for the whole life, that's the meaningful life. So I've this book by Shige Oishi. It's called like Life in Three Dimensions, and he talks about like the happy life, interesting life, and meaningful life. Um, I haven't yet published that podcast, so hopefully I'll get a bunch of them done. So for anyone listening, hopefully you'll be able to hear about all of this stuff: hope,
Yes.
interesting life, the meaningful life, and the happy life. And hope goes across all three of those dimensions, which I love.
Yeah, and I think those are all
So,
important areas. The pleasure, the meaning, the social aspects, those different domains of well-being. How much you focus on one versus the other might vary at given moments, but they are all important things we want to pursue and foster. And we have found in our work, and others have found this as well, that hope is an important predictor of the pleasurable aspects, the meaningful aspects, the social aspects, and that is something that holds up even when controlling for other positive psychology traits. It's across different kind of contexts. And so it's a really powerful predictor in terms of foster mental health, and it's an active predictor. And so I think that's one uh, misunderstanding with hope is that it's the idea like, oh, just, I'll be hopeful for something and you just then wait for good things to happen. What we found in studying hope is it's a very active pursuit of those goals. And so it's not passive, just expectancy, it's the active uh, seeking out how to achieve and maintain well-being. That's important.
yeah. Um, with with regard to the future of hope, what are your hopes for hope?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think, like many areas of psychology, and positive psychology, a lot of the initial work on hope was developed and conducted with pretty homogenous populations. And so, Lawrence, Kansas, where I spent my grad school days, is a great college town, but it's not the most diverse in a number of ways. And so, a lot of the work that my lab and others are doing is how do we understand how hope, whether it's across the lifespan, across different kind of characteristics and identity, how do we understand how hope can benefit people of all backgrounds? And so, where is it something we need to foster more? Where is it going well? How do we cultivate that? How do we promote it in interventions? But helping to make sure that hope is not just kind of a luxury for the few, but a strength and source of resilience that we can foster in as many people as possible.
It, with your own academic career, is there a book for the mass audience on the horizon?
I have not yet taken that pathway of doing the popular press book. I think there are a couple on hope. Rick Snyder did one, Shane Lopez did Making Hope Happen. That's something that might be in the cards for me down the line, but so far I've done more. Did it, the Oxford Handbook of Hope I published with Shane Lopez a number of years ago, but haven't yet gone the popular press route. Might be to come. We'll see.
That's my hope.
Yes. Thank you.
But if people want to learn more about your work, how would you guide them?
Yeah, I think the book that Shane published a number of years ago, Making Hope Happen, that's integrates a lot of the work that Shane and I done on hope, and then there are a lot of resources available in terms of how to understand hope, and a lot of it is geared more towards the scientific community, but there's increasing efforts to make sure we're also writing kind of the chapters and the manuscripts in ways that are accessible, and so it's something that we have found is really beneficial in a lot of contexts. And so my website, University of Houston, identifies a lot of the work that we're doing, studying hope, and many other people in the area that are doing great work to further the science of hope.
I'm guessing it's in your VIA as one of your top strengths.
It
Maybe,
is.
maybe not. Okay, okay.
Yep.
Um, in terms of Gallup, it kind of feels like futuristic corresponds with the goals thinking and strategy with the pathways thinking.
Yeah, that's how
Um,
I've always thought about it in terms of it's more the future oriented thinking is how they have it in that system, but it's still a lot of the same ideas in terms of identifying and pursuing your goals. Sure.
any other strengths that you like from Gallup or the VIA?
Curiosity, I think, going into academia, being a researcher, it makes sense for that to be high end for me and want to understand these things and also foster new knowledge. So that's something that I've always been interested in and have done a little bit of work on as well in terms of studying curiosity. But I think those aspects, I think, go hand in hand with hope in terms of trying to understand things.
Thank you so much. Usually I put strengths kind of in the middle, but here we mentioned it at the end. So
Yeah,
I like to do that. Listeners, you can go to www.viacharacter.org and discover your strengths for free if you have not done so already. And then you can use them to build hope.
absolutely.
Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you.